Picture the largest stone block used in the Great Pyramid of Giza, some weighing in at over 50 tons, roughly the weight of 10 adult elephants standing on top of each other. No picture moving that block, not with a truck, not with a crane, not with any engine of any kind, across miles of open desert to a construction site rising 481 feet into the sky. No wheels turning under it for most of that journey, no engine pulling it, just human muscle, rope, wood, and an almost unreasonable amount of coordinated planning. For the overwhelming majority of human history, this wasn't some special, unusual engineering challenge reserved for pyramids and monuments. This was simply how everything moved. Every sack of grain, every quarried stone, every trade, good crossing a continent, every family relocating to better hunting ground. All of it depended on solving the exact same basic problem. How do you move something heavy without a vehicle, using only the tools and materials available in the ancient world? The answers turn out to be more clever, more varied, and more physically demanding than most people ever stop to consider. Let's start with the most basic transport technology humans ever had, one that required no invention at all: the human body itself. Carrying loads directly on the body, particularly on the head, turns out to be a surprisingly sophisticated, energy-efficient method of transport, studied in real detail by biomechanics researchers over the past several decades. Studies of experienced headloaders, including women in parts of Africa who carry loads on their heads as a routine, daily practice, found something genuinely surprising. Within a certain range, these carriers could transport significant weight, sometimes up to around 20% of their own body weight, with remarkably little additional metabolic energy cost compared to walking unloaded. Researchers studying this phenomenon propose that skilled head carriers may be unconsciously exploiting a kind of pendulum, like energy exchange in their walking gait, converting some of the load's momentum efficiently between steps, rather than simply fighting against the extra weight with pure muscular effort the entire way. This efficiency has real limits, and it depends heavily on training, technique, and load size. But it illustrates something important about ancient transport more broadly. Long before anyone invented a wheel, the human body itself was already a remarkably capable, if limited, transport system, refined not through engineering, but through generations of practiced everyday technique. For genuinely heavy or bulky loads, though, human bodies alone weren't enough, which is where the first real transport technologies come into the story. One of the simplest, oldest solutions to moving heavy loads across land involved almost no invention at all: dragging. The travois, a simple frame made from two long poles crossed and lashed together, with a platform or netting stretched between them, was used extensively by numerous indigenous peoples of the North American plains, originally pulled by domesticated dogs and later following European contact by horses. The genius of the travois lies in its simplicity. It converts a heavy load's friction against the ground into the dragging animal's forward-pulling motion, without needing wheels, axles, or any complex moving parts that could break or require specialized construction skill to build and repair out in the field. Similar drag sled technology developed independently in cold, snowy environments, where sledges, essentially the travois principle adapted with runners instead of dragging poles, could glide across snow and ice with remarkably little friction, allowing a single dog team, or in some documented traditions, even human pullers, to move loads that would be far heavier and harder to shift across bare ground. These weren't primitive stopgaps waiting to be replaced by something better. In their specific environments, deep snow, loose sand, open grassland, drag-based transport was often genuinely more practical and reliable than an early wheeled cart would have been, since wheels tend to perform poorly in soft, uneven, or heavily vegetated terrain, without a properly built and maintained road surface underneath them. Water, wherever it was available, offered ancient humans one of the single biggest transport advantages in the entire ancient toolkit. And it is easy to underestimate just how much of ancient trade and construction actually depended on it. Moving a heavy load across land, even with good drag technology, involves fighting friction and gravity with every single step. Moving that same load by water involves almost none of that resistance, since a boat or raft is essentially floating, buoyancy doing most of the heavy lifting that muscle and friction would otherwise have to fight against on land. Ancient Egyptian construction projects relied heavily on the Nile River specifically for this reason. transporting massive quarried stone blocks by barge over considerable distances, a task that would have been dramatically more difficult, slower, and more labor-intensive if attempted purely by dragging those same blocks overland the entire way. Mesopotamian civilizations built extensive canal networks partly for irrigation, but also specifically to extend this same water transport advantage further inland, artificially creating navigable water routes in places nature hadn't already provided one. Early watercraft themselves varied enormously by region and available materials. Dugout canoes carved from single large logs, reed boats woven from bundled papyrus or similar plant material, and simple log rafts, each representing an independent solution to the same basic physics problem, using buoyancy to defeat the friction and weight that made overland transport of heavy goods so consistently difficult. For societies fortunate enough to be built along a major river or coastline, water transport wasn't a backup option. It was very often the primary preferred method of moving anything genuinely heavy across any meaningful distance. Eventually, ancient humans found a way to borrow strength directly from other species, a development that dramatically expanded what any individual human or small group could realistically move. Donkeys were among the earliest pack animals domesticated for load, carrying, with evidence suggesting domestication in Northeast Africa roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, providing a genuinely significant, multiplying increase in cargo capacity compared to human carriers alone. Oxen, domesticated even earlier as working animals, were harnessed both for pulling loads on drag sledges and later for pulling early wheeled carts, providing sustained pulling power far beyond what human muscle could offer on its own. In the Andes Mountains of South America, llamas were domesticated and extensively used as pack animals across notoriously difficult, high-altitude mountain terrain. Well, suited specifically because of their sure-footedness and tolerance for thin air at elevations that would have exhausted most other draft animals available anywhere else in the ancient world. Camels, domesticated separately in different regions and eventually essential to trans-Saharan and Silk Road trade routes, offered a specific combination of load capacity, water efficiency, and heat tolerance that made genuinely long-distance desert trade routes practically viable in the first place. Connecting distant regions of the ancient world that overland cart or purely human-powered transport alone would never have been able to reliably link together. Pack animal transport didn't replace human portage and drag sledges. It layered on top of them, letting ancient trade networks and construction projects scale up to a size that human muscle power alone, no matter how well organized, simply couldn't have sustained. Now let's return to that 50-ton pyramid block, because the actual technique used to move it is one of the more genuinely elegant pieces of ancient engineering most people never learn about. Ancient Egyptian tomb painting, found in the tomb of a nobleman named Dj-Hutep, depicts a massive stone statue being dragged on a large wooden sledge, with a figure standing at the front of the sledge appears to be pouring liquid directly onto the sand just ahead of the sledge's path. For a long time, this detail was treated as a curious artistic flourish, its actual purpose unclear. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam actually tested the underlying principle directly in a laboratory setting, dragging small loaded sledges across trays of dry sand versus sand wetted to a specific carefully calibrated moisture level. The results were genuinely striking. Wetting the sand to the right consistency reduced the friction resistance in front of the sledge by roughly half, meaning the same team of workers pulling the same rope could move a significantly heavier load, purely because of a wetting technique visible in a 4,000-year-old tomb painting, verified using modern experimental physics. The mechanism involves capillary action. The right amount of water creates small liquid bridges between individual sand grains, effectively binding them together and making the sand surface firmer and less prone to piling up and creating drag resistance directly in front of the moving sledge, an effect that disappears entirely if the sand is either too dry or oversaturated. Ancient Egyptian engineers didn't understand capillary bridging in the way a modern physicist would describe it. They understood, through direct observation and generations of accumulated practical experience, exactly how wet the sand needed to be to make their job measurably easier, and they built that empirical knowledge directly into a technique detailed enough that a research team could recreate and scientifically validate it thousands of years later. Not every megalithic transport mystery has been quite so neatly solved, and Easter Island's iconic Moai statues represent one of archaeology's more actively debated cases. These massive stone figures, some weighing many tons, needed to be transported from a single quarry site to locations scattered across the island, over terrain considerably rougher than the flat desert sand surrounding the Egyptian pyramids. For years, researchers generally assumed the Moai were most likely transported lying down, dragged horizontally on wooden sledges or rollers, similar in basic principle to Egyptian techniques. But local oral tradition on Easter Island had long maintained something quite different, that the statues essentially walked to their final locations, upright the entire time. In 2012, researchers Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt tested this claim directly, using ropes attached to a full-size upright Moai replica, and found that a relatively small team could indeed move the statue by rocking it rhythmically side to side, walking it forward in a manner genuinely reminiscent of how a person might shuffle a heavy refrigerator forward without lifting it. Using momentum and controlled tipping rather than brute continuous dragging force. This experiment doesn't definitively prove every Moai was transported this exact way, and the debate among archaeologists studying Easter Island continues. But it stands as a valuable reminder that local oral tradition, sometimes dismissed too quickly as legend, occasionally turns out to encode genuinely accurate, testable engineering knowledge that outside researchers had simply failed to take seriously enough on its own terms. Given everything covered so far, it is worth directly addressing the technology most people assume must have been essential to all of this in the first place: the wheel. The wheel is, historically speaking, a surprisingly late invention, with the earliest confirmed wheeled vehicles appearing in Mesopotamia roughly 3,500 BCE, meaning humans successfully built pyramids, developed complex agriculture, established long-distance trade networks, and constructed elaborate cities for thousands of years of civilization entirely without it. Even after wheeled carts were invented, their practical usefulness depended heavily on having reasonably flat, well-maintained road surfaces and suitable draft animals to pull them, conditions that simply didn't exist everywhere in the ancient world, which explains a genuinely fascinating exception: the Inca Empire. Despite building one of the most extensive and sophisticated road networks in the ancient world, stretching for thousands of miles across the Andes, the Inca never adopted wheeled vehicles for practical transport, even though wheeled toys, clearly demonstrating that the underlying concept of the wheel itself was known, have actually been found at various archaeological sites within Inca territory. The most widely accepted explanation isn't a failure of insight or engineering ability, but pure environmental logic. The Andes' famously steep, narrow mountain terrain made wheeled carts genuinely impractical compared to sure-footed llama pack trains and human porters navigating the same route. Ease on foot, and the Inca simply never possessed large draft animals comparable to horses or oxen that would have made pulling heavy wheeled carts across that terrain worthwhile in the first place. The wheel wasn't some universal evidently superior technology every sufficiently advanced ancient society was inevitably destined to adopt. It was one tool, genuinely useful in specific environments and circumstances, and genuinely impractical in others. A choice ancient engineers made rationally based on their own actual terrain and available resources, not a milestone every capable civilization was somehow obligated to eventually reach. So how did ancient humans transport things without vehicles? They built an entire layered toolkit. Instead, the human body itself refined through generations of technique into a genuinely efficient carrying system. Simple drag sledges and travois, converting friction into forward motion using nothing but rope, wood, and a pulling animal. Water transport, letting buoyancy quietly do the hardest part of the work that muscle and friction would otherwise have to fight through on land. Domesticated pack animals, multiplying what any human or small group could realistically move. And in the most demanding cases, genuinely sophisticated physical engineering like precisely wetted sand reducing friction by half, or a rhythmic rocking technique capable of walking a multi-ton statue across an island. all of it developed and refined through direct observation, patient trial and error, and knowledge passed down with no formal science behind it at all. None of these solutions required a wheel, an engine, or anything resembling a vehicle in the modern sense. They required something ancient humans consistently had in abundance: careful observation of how physical materials actually behaved under stress, and the sheer patient willingness to organize enormous amounts of coordinated human effort toward solving a problem. One heavy, stubborn object at a time,